Live streaming is on.
Então, muito boa tarde a todos que nos acompanham. Iniciamos nosso segundo dia do nosso Fórum Internacional de Direitos Fundamentais e iniciamos o nosso dia com uma presença muito especial, né? Iniciamos com a presença do professor Matthew Kramer, professor que nos brindará hoje com uma conferência sobre liberdade de expressão, né, e autorresistência. Professor Kramer é professor de Direito e de Filosofia Política na Universidade de Cambridge. Ele também é fellow no Churchill College e na British Academy, né? Ele tem doutorado pela Universidade de Harvard, nos Estados Unidos, e PhD e também doutorado pela Universidade de Cambridge, no Reino Unido. Então, tenho muita alegria aqui de estar recebendo o professor Kramer. Thank you, Professor, for your presence in our event. And please, take free to start your conference.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry, let me... Sorry, I'm just... Right, here's what I want. Okay, there we go. I assume, are you folks seeing this? Are you folks seeing an outline of my talk or not?
Yes, it's perfectly.
You're seeing it. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so you see freedom of expression. Okay, so thank you. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation, and I'm pleased to participate in this conference. I'm sorry that I have to speak in English. As I've said to Jose, I do speak French, but I don't speak Portuguese. I don't speak Spanish. So English, I think, is the best language in which to present this talk. So I'm going to omit this portion, the final portion, because I'm going to speak for about 30 minutes. So I'll cover the first three topics here. And the title of the talk is Freedom of Expression as Self-Restraint. That was also the title of my 2021 book on this matter. And in a sense, the talk I'm giving today is a distillation of a few strands from that book, though obviously there's far, far more. The book is about 350 pages, so there's far more in it than I can cover here, even cursorily. So I'm going to start with a brief statement of what I regard as the principle of freedom of expression, which I defend in my 2021 book. And that principle can be stated as follows: that a necessary condition for the moral permissibility of any legal governmental restriction on modes of expression is that those modes of expression are constitutive of communication independent misconduct. So let me say that once more. It's a bit of a mouthful. I'm not reading from a text here, so if the wording isn't exactly the same, then please forgive me, but it will be very close, if not exactly the same. A necessary condition for the moral permissibility of any legal governmental restriction on some mode of expression is that the mode of expression in question is constitutive of communication independent misconduct. That's the principle that I'm going to be defending here, or at least sketching a defense of. And that principle, I argue in my 2021 book, is a moral absolute. It's an absolute moral principle. So the first thing to cover here is what I mean when I characterize a moral principle as absolute. What I mean is that such a principle is always and everywhere binding, that there are no exceptions to its sway, that there are no occasions on which it is suspended or canceled. And therefore, the principle of freedom of expression, which I just articulated, would bind every system of governance, even though most systems of governance blithely disregard it or contravene it. Nonetheless, it binds every system of governance such that a system of governance is committing moral wrongs when it acts at variance with this principle of freedom of expression that I've articulated, this moral principle. And so I'm characterizing that principle as morally absolute in precisely this sense, that it is exceptionless. There are no exceptions to the binding scope of that principle, either at any given time or over time. And in precisely that sense of being exceptionless, the principle of freedom of expression is indeed a moral absolute. Now, there are two types of absoluteness that should be distinguished here. The type that I've been talking about is what I would call weak absoluteness. And that simply is the exceptionless character of the principle that I've been discussing. It's a moral absolute in precisely that sense, that it is always and everywhere applicable. That is to be differentiated from what I would call strong absoluteness, where a strongly absolute moral principle is weakly absolute. That is, it's exceptionless in its scope. But in addition, it is a more stringent moral principle than any other moral principle that might conflict with it on some occasion. And so in that sense, it is the most stringent moral principle that there can be. And I'm not arguing here, and I don't argue in my book, that the principle of freedom of expression is a strongly absolute moral principle. I think that there may be, and indeed undoubtedly are, some moral principles that are even more stringent than this one. Nonetheless, even when a more stringent principle conflicts with a less stringent moral principle that is absolute, weakly absolute, that weakly absolute principle will continue to obtain. It will continue to bind whatever party or parties are bound under it. And so even moral conflicts between binding moral principles, where the morally correct course of action is to comply with the more stringent principle, nonetheless, in so doing, someone will be contravening the less stringent moral principle. And in precisely that sense, even the less moral stringent principle is absolute. It continues to bind and continues to be binding, even in a situation where the morally correct thing to do is to transgress it, to contravene it in some desperately extreme set of circumstances. So I'm arguing here that the principle of freedom of expression is weakly absolute. It is always and everywhere binding. Every system of governance is bound by it, even though most systems of governance do not comply with it at any high level. Okay, so the next matter then is the absolutist position on freedom of expression. Well, again, that is the principle that I've already articulated. So let me state it once more, and then I'm going to elucidate a particularly important element of it. So once more, that principle of freedom of expression as self-restraint is the principle which provides that a necessary condition for the moral permissibility of any legal governmental restriction on any given mode of communicative conduct is that mode of communicative conduct is constitutive of communication independent wrongdoing. Now, that principle invokes the notion of communication independent wrongdoing or communication independent misconduct. And Therefore, that notion needs some elucidation here. It's not just an everyday notion that where I can take for granted your pre-theoretical acquaintance with it. I need to elucidate it in the context of my account of freedom of expression. So when I use the phrase communication independent misconduct or communication independent wrongdoing, what I mean is misconduct or wrongdoing that can be perpetrated either communicatively or non-communicatively. In other words, it can be perpetrated either through some conduct that is communicative or through some conduct that is non-communicative. And in either case, the type of misconduct is being perpetrated. So let me give a couple of examples here just to try to clarify this point and amplify this point. Let's take a famous example from the, from the law of freedom of expression in the United States. I am an American by origin, even though I've lived quite a bit more than half my life in England. But even if I weren't American, I couldn't fail to be familiar with the enormous repository of materials and distinctions and doctrines in American constitutional law because of the First Amendment to the American Constitution, which guarantees, among other freedoms, freedom of expression. And so it's actually freedom of speech, but it's the same thing. And under that amendment, there have been hundreds and hundreds, well, probably thousands and thousands of cases decided by the courts, including the US Supreme Court, the highest court. And in one of those cases in the second decade of the 20th century, Oliver Wendell Holmes, writing for the majority, furnished an example. He wasn't specifically talking about communication independent misconduct as such, but still his example illustrates the nature of communication independent misconduct vividly. And that was his example of someone shouting fire in a crowded theater, fire in a crowded theater. Now, at the time Holmes was writing, most of the lighting was still through gas fires and the like. And so it wasn't yet fully electrified. And so the example is particularly vivid in those circumstances where shouting fire could itself lead to the spreading of a fire through damage to these gas burners and the like. And in any event, in the circumstances where it's a crowded theater, it's dark, and someone shouts fire in a convincing way, but a malicious way, that is, the party who cries fire knows that in fact there is no fire. In these circumstances, what that person is seeking to do is to instigate a serious public disturbance, to bring about serious public disorder in which people will be injured or even killed, and in which there will be damage to property, and in which the whole production that would have been staged in the theater is disrupted, and so forth. So this is an instance then of instigating or seeking to instigate a serious public disturbance, bringing about or seeking to bring about serious public disorder. And that is a communication independent mode of wrongdoing. Someone can bring about or someone can engage in that sort of wrongdoing through communicative conduct. And it was certainly an example here of communicative conduct, the shouting of fire. The man who maliciously engages in this shout was seeking to communicate a clear message and a clear alarm. But in so doing, was because he was doing this maliciously, was seeking to bring about a serious public disturbance. And so that sort of wrongdoing could have been engaged in non-communicatively. So someone, for example, might have started a fight, perhaps with a colleague who was in on the scheme, or might have shot a gun, or might have started a fire, for that matter. Any of those modes of conduct, which are non-communicative, could nonetheless have instigated a serious public disorder of the same type that was brought about, or at least attempted to have been brought about, through the shouting of the alarm fire. And so this is a communication independent mode of misconduct, in that it can be perpetrated either communicatively or non-communicatively. And so that's what makes it communication independent. Now, let me offer one further example here, since this notion of communication independent wrongdoing is so important for my principle of freedom of expression. Let me take an example that is in John Stuart Mill's classic text on liberty. Mill discusses in that text an example of an orator, a fiery orator, who outside the home of a corn dealer, that is a grain dealer, a dealer in grain, incites a mob through this angry tirade against the iniquity of corn dealers. The firebrand orator incites a mob to undertake a lynching of the corn dealer who lives in this house where the orator and the mob are located. And in so doing, the orator, the speaker, participates in a very serious mode of wrongdoing that is clearly communication independent. That is, someone can participate in a lynching. One way might be, for example, to place a rope around the victim's neck, or another way might be to start a fire under the victim, or whatever the mode of homicide might be. But another way to participate in a lynching is to instigate it. That is, to aim to bring it about in circumstances where it is very likely that the lynching will occur, precisely through one's efforts to whip up the fury of the mob, as this incendiary oration does. So that too is a speech by the firebrand orator is a communication independent mode of wrongdoing, in that it constitutes his participation in a lynching, which of course is a communication independent crime. And so there as well, we have a type of communication that can nonetheless perfectly legitimately be subjected to legal sanctions, indeed very heavy legal sanctions, precisely because it is constitutive of a type of communication independent wrongdoing, namely participation in a lynching. So when I talk about communication independent misconduct, that's the sort of thing to which I'm referring. Okay. All right. So under the principle of freedom of expression, which I've articulated, any system of governance to which that principle applies, and it applies to every such system, as I've already said, will be morally obligated, morally required to abide by certain constraints of neutrality. That is, the sorts of laws that are introduced or implemented by that system of governance must be neutral in certain important respects that bear directly on the principle of freedom of expression. So in my book, I go through four main types of neutrality here. So let me go through each of these types briefly here in my remaining time. As I've already said, I'm going to omit this final part about justifications. I'll just mention briefly here that clearly the principle of freedom of expression does have to be justified. It can't just be taken as a dogma. And the fourth chapter of my book, chapter 4 in my 2021 book, is devoted to expounding the justification for this principle. So I have indeed justified the principle. Here, however, because of constraints of time, I'll have to omit the portion on justification, though I'm happy to answer questions about that portion afterward if anyone would like to ask them. But I'm going to finish here by going through each of these types of neutrality, which any system of governance is morally obligated to comply with under the principle of freedom of expression. So the first of these is what I call communication neutrality. It's obviously very closely connected to communication independence. But what is involved here in communication neutrality is that a system of governance cannot, as a matter of moral permissibility, cannot differentiate between those instances of some type of conduct that are communicative and those instances of some type of conduct that are non-communicative. That would be a failure of the system of governance in question to abide by this constraint of communication neutrality. So let me offer a little example here to illustrate the point that I think will help to make it more clear for everyone. I'll take an example that has been quite salient over the past 15 months or so on American university campuses and indeed on university campuses in many countries throughout the world. And there have been encampments by demonstrators of various sorts, usually pro-Hamas demonstrators, on various American university campuses. And a question arises then whether encampments on the premises of university campuses are normally allowed, and provided that certain conditions are met, for example, obtaining permission and perhaps paying a certain fee for the costs that will be borne and so forth. But those sorts of restrictions are unproblematic. It obviously can't be that use of the grounds of a university campus would be completely unrestricted. But the question is whether people can be forbidden to engage in the mode of conduct that we might call setting up encampments on the grounds. Well, one crucial question there is whether permission is granted in a way that differentiates between communicative encampments, that is, encampments that are set up as modes of protest, and encampments that are not communicative, encampments that are set up for various other reasons. Well, a university cannot, in conformity to the principle of freedom of expression, it cannot differentiate between those sorts of encampments. So if a university allows only encampments that are forms of protest, that are set up by demonstrators who are seeking to convey messages through their encampments, then that is at variance with the principle of freedom of expression. If the university would not allow encampments that are set up by people who aren't seeking to convey messages of protest, or indeed any messages. And since, as far as I'm aware, most universities do not allow encampments that are set up by people who are not demonstrating, except perhaps in special circumstances where the university itself is involved in arranging the events, then I take it that the permission that has in effect been extended, by, at least in the United States, to many of these encampments is at variance with the principle of freedom of expression, because people are being allowed to engage in some type of conduct, that is setting up encampments, simply because their instances of that type of conduct are communicative. And so this, if it wouldn't be the case that they could, that they would be permitted to persist with quite disruptive encampments, if those encampments were not communicative, then this is a failure on the part of the university to comply with the principle of freedom of expression, because it is not the case that any university can permissibly differentiate between communicative types of communicative instances of some type of conduct and non-communicative instances of some type of conduct. So that's what I have in mind when I talk about communication neutrality. Subject neutrality, the second type here, concerns the range of topics that any system of governance, whether it's a university or whether it's a whole system of governance, would permit. So let's take an example. So the principle of freedom of expression requires that if some public forum exists, that is, some forum that is used and which really has to be used by people to communicate their sentiments and thoughts and so forth, then a system of governance cannot permissibly discriminate among the subjects or topics that can be addressed. So let's take, again, an example to help to illustrate and clarify this point. Suppose that a local government operates a network of buses for the community, and that on the sides and backs of the buses, there are panels that are made available to individuals or organizations who want, for small fees, pay to have advertisements or notices posted on these panels. And so as the buses go along, they're in effect serving as advertising boards for the companies or individuals or organizations that pay to have their advertisements or notices posted. Well, according to the principle of freedom of expression, the local government cannot permissibly restrict the range of topics to be addressed through these advertisements or notices. So suppose the local government provides that no advertisements or notices concerning religious matters, for example, are permitted, or no advertisements or notices concerning the matter of abortion, or concerning the matter of immigration, for example, that none of these matters can be addressed by people or organizations who wish to post advertisements or notices. Well, that's a subject-specific restriction. That's a subject differentiating restriction that is not morally permissible under the moral principle of freedom of expression, because any system of governance has to remain neutral with regard to the range of topics that are addressed in public fora and fora that are used in a public way for the communication of events or sentiments or thoughts and so forth. So that is another type of neutrality required under the principle of freedom of expression. Even more demanding is the next type of neutrality, that of viewpoint neutrality. And suppose, going back to the example of the encampments on university campuses, suppose that some encampments are tolerated by the universities for long periods of time, whereas others are not. So suppose, for example, that these pro-Hamas demonstrators are tolerated by the university campuses, even though their encampments are prolonged and disruptive, but that let's say Ku Klux Klan members who set up encampments in protest against immigration, for example, are not tolerated. Their encampments are very promptly removed. Well, that is at variance with the requirement of viewpoint neutrality. No system of governance can permissibly differentiate among potential communicators on the basis of their viewpoints. And so going back to the example of the municipal buses with the side panels and the back panels that can be used for advertisements and notices, that local government is not morally permitted under the principle of freedom of expression to exclude certain individuals or organizations on the basis of their viewpoints. So it's not morally permitted, for example, to exclude the Communist Party or the Ku Klux Klan or any other individual or organization on the basis of the viewpoint of the party. Of course, if the communications that are being posted are defamatory or otherwise illegal, then they of course can be excluded. I've argued in my book at some length that defamation is a communication independent mode of wrongdoing. So that sort of wrongdoing can of course be excluded. But I'm talking about the simple posting of messages that aren't themselves constitutive of communication independent wrongdoing. And the question arises whether someone can be excluded from posting the messages simply on the basis of that party's viewpoint. And the answer to that question is no, that cannot permissibly be done under the principle of freedom of expression as self-restraint, because it is at odds with the requirement of viewpoint neutrality. Okay, the final type, and here I will conclude, the final type of neutrality that I discuss in my book, and the final type that I will discuss here, is speaker neutrality. Now, this type of neutrality is obviously very closely related to viewpoint neutrality. That is, if a particular person or a particular organization is excluded, whereas nobody else is, then usually that will be because of the viewpoint of that person or organization, in other words, to keep out the communication of that viewpoint from whatever public forum is under consideration. So these are very closely connected, but they're not equivalent. So there can be speaker specific restrictions that are not viewpoint discriminatory, but nonetheless are discriminatory on the basis of the identity of speakers. A classic instance of this was in place in the United Kingdom from 1988 to 1994. And during that time, a legal prohibition was in effect on the broadcasting of the voices of members of Northern Irish terrorist groups such as the Irish Republican Army and some of the Ulster paramilitary groups, the Protestant paramilitary groups. As I imagine you folks are aware, during that period from the early 1970s to really the late 1990s, there were very serious acts of violence, acts of terrorism perpetrated both in Northern Ireland and in parts of the United Kingdom and in parts of England, and mainly by the Irish Republican Army, but also by Protestant paramilitary groups. And the British government in the late 1980s responded by introducing this speaker-specific restriction on the broadcasting of voices. So during this period, the BBC and other British broadcasters were legally forbidden to air the voices of Northern Irish terrorists. However, during this period, the messages of these terrorists, that is, the words that they were speaking, for example, could be read out by actors, actors with Northern Irish accents who could imitate the voices of these terrorists, and that was still lawful. So it wasn't a viewpoint specific restriction. It was a pure speaker specific restriction that excluded the voices of certain people on the basis of their identities, but it didn't exclude their viewpoints from being communicated, because as I've said, actors could read out what these terrorists had said and simulate their voices, and so the viewpoints weren't being excluded, but the speakers' voices were being excluded. If this sounds rather silly to you, I share your attitude, because I felt throughout this period that that was a really silly state of affairs. But for nearly 6 years, that was the legal situation in the UK. So that's an example of a purely speaker-specific restriction, and it is manifestly at odds with the principle of freedom of expression. So the principle of freedom of expression is quite a demanding principle. It demands a lot of any system of governance, because abiding by these constraints of neutrality is not easily done. And indeed, pretty much every system of governance in the actual world departs from those constraints of neutrality in various ways. But it's not impossible. That is, I don't think it's fanciful to think that a system of governance could live up to these requirements. And I indicate many ways in my book that would enable this. But still, the principle does require a justification, a compelling justification. And as I've said, I do provide such a justification in my book, but I will not have time for that here. And so I will now close. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, very much for your lecture. We have a high qualified and large audience following us. We are currently over 400 students watching in arriving platforms.
Wow, I'm pleased to hear that.
I must confess that I found particularly thought-provoking as a topic that I have a greatly interest on me. Recently, I wrote a paper on freedom of expression.
Oh, right.
And in my case, I discussed a Brazilian congressman who made a terrible insults and slurs against the judges of our Supreme Court.
Right.
The same congressman also incited his colleagues and another Brazilian citizens to attempt to overthrow the elected government.
Right.
This ultimately led the attempted coup 2 years ago, and the acts in Brazil, as 8th of January. I don't know if this news.
Yes.
Yes.
It was very prominently covered in the British news. Yeah.
Okay. If I may ask a brief question, in your opinion, should we limit an anti-democratic speech to protect the rule of law? Should we have to draw a clear boundary between legitimate political discourse and the hate speech in politics that pose to treat the democracy?
Right. Well, that's an excellent question. In my book, I discuss hate speech. There's a long chapter. Well, in fact, there were really 2 long chapters on hate speech. And so I do address the matter. But I'm going to offer an example which I didn't address in my 2021 book because it arose too late for me to include it there. But I have discussed it in a subsequent book, a 2022 book. And that is the harangue, the tirade delivered by Donald Trump on January 6th, 2021, which prefigured the insurrection or attempted insurrection in Brazil sometime later. So on that date, just over 4 years ago, Trump, as you folks probably know, Trump delivered an angry diatribe against the Democratic Party and people cooperating with them on the ground that the election had been stolen. I should say, because of Trump's extravagant narcissism, because of his extravagant egomania, I don't know whether he genuinely believes that the election was stolen from him because he's just not capable of admitting to himself that he could lose, or whether he knows that he lost the election and he just deliberately deceives his gullible followers. I don't know, but that doesn't really matter. In any event, he delivered this incendiary oration to his followers, and then they proceeded to the Capitol building where Congress conducts its affairs, and they sought, in effect, to block the peaceful transition of power. And of course, we know that very recently Trump has pardoned nearly every one of those insurrectionaries. So I have argued in a 2022 book of mine that that harangue, that tirade delivered by Trump on January 6th, 2021, was incitement. That is, it was an instance of incitement under the requirements for such a mode of misconduct laid down in 1969 by the U.S. Supreme Court in a well-known American case called Brandenburg v. Ohio. And there are requirements that have to be met if a mode of fiery speech is to be classifiable as incitement rather than as mere advocacy. And I think there's no question that, especially when one listens to the speech, on the page, it might seem as though it falls just short of incitement. But when one listens to it, one can grasp, I think, very clearly that it was aimed entirely at whipping up the fury of this mob so that they would then go and perpetrate very serious misconduct. And in that event, it is itself Trump's mode of participating in that misconduct. And so I believe that he should have been arrested and charged and tried and convicted for attempting to bring about an insurrection and the blocking of a transition of government. And so that's the sort of speech that I think can be subjected to legal sanctions entirely in conformity with the principle of freedom of expression. I don't see the principle of freedom of expression as an obstacle at all to the moral legitimacy of outlawing that sort of misconduct.
Oh, perfectly. Oh, thank you so much, Professor. I sincerely appreciated your disponibility to speak with us. Your lecture, you very the public are very happy to listen you speaking, and we are truly honored in receive you in your institution. If you allow me, I will proceed to closing remarks.
That's fine. Well, let me just say that I'm very pleased to have spoken to your conference, and I'm grateful to you for extending the invitation.
Thank you, Professor. Então, agradeço a todos, né, que acompanharam a conferência do professor. Destaco que nós temos a nossa lista de presença disponível no chat e seguimos o nosso evento, né? Logo mais temos outra conferência agora às 3 horas da tarde. Então, agradeço novamente a todos e um bom segmento de fórum para todos nós. Obrigado.